welcome everybody who has already joined, the people in the general audience, and so many faces that I can see today between the panelists. So we have the pleasure of having with us today a two-person presentation. First, Madeline Zavodny, coming directly from North Florida, will be telling us about compensating differentials. She has worked on every possible relevant topic about immigration, mostly on the US. And later on, we will have Chad Sparber, taking it from her, from Colgate University. He's done also some amazing work on immigration into the US, immigration policy for the last 10 years that I have been reading the literature. So they are a great team to have with us today. So Madeline, I think everything is set up. So I leave you the floor.
All right, wonderful. So enormous thank you to Jesús for the invitation. It's been a wonderful seminar series to see since the spring, and I look forward to seeing the future seminars as well. I think that you all sharing this online and opening it up is just a huge public service to the profession, and Chad and I are just delighted to be a part of it today. So we welcome everyone's feedback on this paper, both during the talk and after via private emails, the Q&A during the talk, and so on. The title is really sums up the paper in large part, that the paper is looking at how immigration affects working conditions and compensating differentials. We're looking here in the case of less educated workers in the United States over roughly the last 30 years or so. And so just to give you a quick roadmap of what we're going to be doing for the next 45 minutes, I'll talk kind of the general background, what we view as our contributions to the literature, and then the data. Then we'll switch over to the empirical methodology and results with Chad, first thinking about job characteristics, so these working conditions, which are really occupational measures. Then we'll switch over to compensating differentials, and then I'll talk some about policy implications. All right, so to start here, three big stylized facts kind of about the US labor market. I realize some of you are huge experts on immigration in the United States, even more so than Chad and I, whereas for others of you who are working primarily in other countries, perhaps the US context is a little bit less familiar. So just to get us all up on the same page here. The first thing is that immigrants in the United States are disproportionately less educated. And so this makes the United States in some ways different from, say, Canada, Australia, and some European countries. So what this figure is showing here is the share of the labor force that's foreign-born. So all foreign-born, regardless of legal status or visa status or what have you. Here by 5 education groups over our sample period, which is running 1990 to 2018. And so what you see is that at the very low end of the education distribution among workers who have not finished high school, a very large share are foreign-born. For the labor force as a whole during this period, it's about 14% are foreign-born. So you can see that more than twice that within the high school dropout category of the labor force. And then at the other end of the labor force, those with a lot of education, so basically all of us, we once again see that the labor force is disproportionately foreign-born. This is not the group that we're interested in this paper. In parts, we're talking about hazardous jobs. We're very lucky, right, in that our jobs are not particularly hazardous. So we're going to focus in this paper on the low end of the labor force, right? And the share of workers who are foreign-born within those two education groups, the high school dropouts and the high school degree, expanded substantially during the sample period. Part of this was due to an inflow of immigrants into the United States, and part of the increase during this period was due to US natives aging out and leaving the labor force into retirement in these relatively low education groups. The second stylized facts is that in the United States, immigrants tend to work in worse jobs than US natives. So some of my research with Pia Arrhenius looks at this by injury and fatality rates, as does work by Joni Hirsch and Kip Viscusi, that immigrants, perhaps not surprisingly, given that difference in education levels, tend to be concentrated in occupations with higher injury and fatality rates. I have some other research that shows that immigrants are more likely to work in physically difficult jobs that include more hazards, even within occupation groups. So we're going to look up even within education groups as well. So we're going to look some at that within this paper as well. And there's been other research by Dillander and McInerney very recently that looks at this as well. So just to give you a kind of a quick preview here of what our data are going to look like that we're going to use within this paper. This is showing you here kind of a preview of our measures of occupational exposure to hazards by sex or gender and education level. And so the taller the bar, basically the more hazardous the average job held by natives in blue or by immigrants in red here is within that education group. And I think there's some interesting things here to see just in these stylized facts. One is that perhaps not surprisingly, the exposure to occupational hazards declines with education, and that decline is much bigger for men than for women. The second thing is women tend to be in safer jobs, particularly at relatively low education levels, that you see a much steeper education hazard gradient for men than for women. And kind of the third stylized factor is that the differences by nativity at those low education levels are much bigger for women than for men. So I think when Chad and I were first thinking about, what do we want to do within this paper, we weren't really particularly thinking about sex or gender as being an important component. And it turns out it is, and that's something you're going to hear a lot about for the next 45 minutes or so. Right, the third stylized fact, just to sort of set up the paper, is that immigrants are not only in worse jobs, but immigration appears to have resulted in U.S. natives moving into better jobs. And we can categorize better along a variety of dimensions, just like we can categorize worse jobs along a variety of dimensions. And so we know from Giovanni and Chad's earlier work that as a result of immigration, U.S. natives have tended to move into communications intensive occupations. That at the low end of the education distribution, U.S. natives have moved out of manual intensive jobs into communication intensive jobs as a result of immigration. While at the high end of the labor market, U.S. natives have moved out of computationally intensive jobs, perhaps into communication intensive jobs. Again, we're not going to look at the high end of the labor market very much here. Bon, Giantella, and Jablonski have some very interesting work recently looking at U.S. natives and immigrants moving across time of day when they work, or weekdays versus weekends, and that immigration appears to cause U.S. natives to move into better jobs in terms of being out of shift work, be that nights or weekends. And then Dillander and McInerney again have this recent paper where they look at U.S. native men and only men moving into safer jobs as a result of immigration. So there's some previous evidence that I think our paper is going to add to, as I'll talk about in a minute, but is very consistent with. And there's also a nice literature for European countries as well that finds somewhat similar results. All right. Just to give you a little bit of more background here, we don't have a formal model within the paper, but just to think about in theory, what would we expect to have happen to natives as a result of immigration? The first thing is we would think that just the labor market's getting bigger in the United States as a result of immigration. And if the immigrants coming in are different from US natives, we would probably expect US natives to move into jobs that are going to be their comparative advantage. Since US natives tend to speak English better than immigrants, we would expect that jobs that emphasize communication skills, particularly speaking, writing, communicating in English, are going to be their comparative advantage relative to the immigrants. The second thing that could happen, though, that makes this maybe a more interesting story is that employers can respond as well in terms of the types of jobs that they offer when there's an influx of immigrants into an area. And in particular, if the immigrants coming in have a lot of a particular type of skill, the jobs themselves may change to emphasize that skill. So if you have a lot of immigrants coming in who are very good at manual intensive jobs and are willing to take hazardous jobs, maybe employers don't make those jobs safer. Maybe employers continue to keep jobs that are very manual intensive instead of automating those jobs and not replacing labor with capital like they might if immigration wasn't coming into an area. So this might actually mean that natives aren't changing into safer jobs because employers don't offer safer jobs when immigrants are coming in. It's an interesting possibility. A third thing that could happen when immigrants come in is that the compensating differential may change. So we, expect that worse jobs should pay a compensating differential, all else equal, right? But as immigrants are coming in, maybe immigrants have different expectations as to what different jobs will pay. And this is what some of my earlier research shows, is just because we perceive a job as bad, somebody who's from another country where job conditions are maybe much, much worse might not see that same job as bad. And they might be willing, some particularly low education immigrants might be willing to take these jobs for a lower premium. And as a result, the compensating differential may shrink as immigrants come in. At the same time, as we discussed in the paper, employer costs related to safety may rise because you may have more difficulty training immigrants who don't speak English to comply with OSHA rules or occupational safety and health rules in the United States. And of course, when certain skills, particularly manual intensive skills, become more abundant, the compensating differential for those skills should be falling. Right? Just because there's an increase in labor supply there. Right? So that's kind of the theoretical background. So we think, we expect to see compensating differentials fall, but, there are reasons we could think it might go a little bit differently. All right.
Madeline,
yes.
Can I ask a quick question? Are you going to tie these to welfare changes due to immigrant shocks or not? Because say if we interpret some of these effects as exploiting competitive advantage, it has some implications for welfare, whereas if it's displacement, it has some other interpretations for welfare. So I don't know if you're going to try to tie those or simply explore the different mechanisms.
So by welfare, you mean transfer programs or happiness?
I mean happiness.
Okay. Always a confusing point. I've been teaching undergrads all semester, so
sorry.
Yeah. So we are not going to do, some grand kind of welfare calculation at the end, but we would think that higher wages make people happier. So we're going to look at the change in these compensating differentials. And you could think if your compensating differentials going up for being in one of these jobs, you're better off. Or if you're in a better job in terms of better working conditions, you're better off. That's the only way in which we're going to look at welfare. Good question. Thank you. All right. So to move into the contributions that we make in the paper, as you've probably gathered by now, there's really two. The first is that we're going to look at how immigration has affected the types of jobs that low education U.S. natives hold. So this really is updating Giovanni and Chad's work on manual and communication skills, but then we're adding this part about job hazards. Unlike Dillander and McInerney, we're going to look at all less educated immigrants coming into the U.S., whereas they just look at Mexicans. And as I said before, an important part of the story, somewhat to our initial surprise, turns out to be differences by sex or gender. And so we're really going to emphasize that in the talk, and we do in the paper as well. And then the second part, which I think is perhaps the bigger contribution of the paper, is to look at what's happened to these compensating differentials, be it a premium for working in a worse job, or maybe it's really a penalty, but does that penalty get bigger? And so how are these returns to these occupational measures of conditions changed? And we are aware of previous research directly on this. The one exception is that Bongiantella and Lonsky do look at the shift differential when they find that immigration caused U.S. natives to move out of shift work and into kind of regular 9-to-5 jobs. They find that the shift premium falls. And so our research is complementary to that, but looking at other measures of occupational characteristics. All right, so the data that we're going to use are going to be from the ONET, and Chad did the heroic work with this. The ONET, I think people are increasingly familiar with it. If you're of my generation, you knew this is the Dictionary of Occupational Titles, actually, that the ONET replaced it. The ONET is this enormous database of occupational characteristics where people who are in these occupations are rating many, many, many measures of their job on scales of 1 to 5. So Chad went through these data and he created percentiles. So we took the kind of 0 to 5 or 1 to 5 measures and made them from 0 to 100 for 439 occupations. And in essence, the higher you are in these percentiles, the bigger the share of the workforce below you. So if you were at the 100th percentile in occupational hazards, you're basically in the most dangerous occupation. If you're in the 90th percentile for communication skills intensity, then 90% of occupations are less communications intensive than your occupation is. So we take these ONET data for 439 occupations, and then we merge them into IPUMS data from the decennial census and the American Community Survey for the years that you see here, 90, 2000, 2010, and 2018. Again, we're going to focus on in the paper on just what we're calling less educated workers, those who at most have a high school diploma. The more educated group is really interesting, but in general, their jobs are better already, right? There's not a lot of hazard exposure there, which is one of the bigger contributions of the paper. We look at ages 18 to 67, not enrolled in school, not in group quarters, your occupation matches with which almost everybody does, blah, blah, blah. Okay, quick commercial break before I move into the data. Cynthia and Nicole, this is for you. If you didn't know, Cynthia and Nicole and I have a second edition of our undergrad textbook out. There's the link. Y'all should use it if you teach a course on the economics of immigration. All right. Back to regularly scheduled programming. I teach undergrads online all semester. I do a lot of this kind of stuff. Yes?
Yeah. So if you were in this ONET data, if you were looking at a very detailed occupation or job, hazard level of this job more or less remains stable over time?
So one thing is that the ONET data that we're using are cross-sectional. We're using a relatively recent version of the ONET, but we can't get the hazard intensity, the manual skill intensity, or the communications intensity, the three things that we created from the ONET. We can't get at how those have changed over time. What we're looking at is how the occupations held by US natives changed, and as a result, how their exposure to hazardous conditions, manual skill intensity, and communications intensity changed as a result of changes in their occupation. So the ideal measure here would be to know what your conditions are at your job. And unfortunately, those data aren't really readily available for the United States. And the ONET in its earlier years is much smaller samples, I would say, of respondents by occupation. So trying to look at kind of changes in occupational conditions over time in the ONET is kind of not really what the ONET's good for.
Thank you.
So yeah, that would be kind of what we would really love to do. But if anyone's aware of those kinds of data, we'd be really interested in working on it with you. But
Madeline, can I interject? This is Dean Young. I see what you're doing here. Very exciting stuff. I'm wondering, in interpreting what you're finding, whether we should be thinking about time trends or what you know about the time trend in the extent to which immigrants take more dangerous jobs. That certainly can change over time as, migrants potentially invest in education at home and perhaps can transition to, quote unquote, better jobs, less dangerous jobs. This happens to be something that I've been thinking about because it's something we're actually finding in the Philippines. If you look at, obviously a very different migrant population, but sort of Filipino migrant workers working in contract jobs around the world, it looks like there's a clear time trend over decades in Filipino migrant workers being able to basically skill upgrade.
Sure.
Maybe not necessarily for themselves, but like for their children as they invest in their kids' education. Let next generations of migrants go into more skilled jobs.
Okay. Yeah, we're not doing, that's a good paper on the assimilation. That we are, I'm going to show you the picture over time for the immigrants and how their occupations characteristics are changing. We're not focused on that in this paper. We're just looking at the US natives, but I'll show it to you. So one more minute. Okay.
I mean, it's a relevant contextual thing though, like for thinking about your results, how should we expect these forces to change over time if the immigrants are, treading towards greater skill and, going into, being less prone to go into these going into these more dangerous jobs, perhaps the effects that you're identifying will become less prominent over time, or maybe the opposite will be true. I mean, so like the trends, that's why I'm asking about the trends.
Yeah, that's a good point. We'll think about it, but I'm going to show you the trends in a minute. First, just because the hazardous thing is the big contribution, I think Chad and Giovanni have done really excellent work on manual and communication skills. Just to give you an idea of some really cruddy jobs out there: firefighters, roofers, etc. Economists are the 1%. We are in some of the safest jobs, not surprisingly. What I think is particularly interesting, though, here is that there's more variation in the distribution of immigrants and natives across these jobs than you might expect or have ever thought about. And maybe this makes some sense that like firefighters and police officers are heavily native born, in large part because those are civil service or government jobs, whereas some other very hazardous jobs are very immigrant intensive, like construction laborers. So there's not perfect segregation across occupations, but there are differences. Okay. Also, perhaps not surprising, but interesting, I think, is that hazardous jobs tend to be manual intensive. So this is the size of the bubble reflects the size of the cell. And this is the hazard percentile and the manual percentile of our occupations being shown here. And then the darkness of it is how communications intensive the job is in our attempt to sort of graph here in 3D. What you see is that the bubbles are sort of clustered on that 45-degree line. And so our hazard results in some way look like our manual results because there's a lot of overlap, particularly from men in those job conditions, but not perfect. Not all the bubbles are on the 45-degree line. All right, so back to Dean's point about looking at hazard exposure. Again, we're going to focus on U.S. natives, but this also shows for immigrants for over time what the average percentile is in our sample of these less educated workers. What you see is not surprisingly men are in more hazardous jobs than women, but U.S. born women are in much safer jobs. But for men, there's this really interesting flip that actually happens between 1990 and 2005 in terms of that initially US born men are in the more hazardous jobs in 1990, and by 2005 that changes. So I don't know that that's consistent with what you'd expected, Dean, but interesting.
Well, I mean, this is certainly the opposite from the standpoint that I was coming from. I mean, from the Philippines, we're actually finding the opposite, but that's obviously a very distinct migrant outflow population. And this is actually, I think, really informative that the forces you're identifying, given that you're actually seeing an increasing propensity for immigrants to come into these more hazardous jobs, the forces you're identifying in this paper may become more prominent and important over the time. This is really great context.
Okay, so manual skills, communication skills. Not surprisingly, US born women are in very communications intensive jobs relative to the other groups. All right, so to move into what we're actually going to do in the paper instead of kind of the background and the setup.
This is Lydia. So you are talking about, it's a story about compensating wage differentials and probably gender, and you are showing the exposure to hazards and also, so can you go back to the last slide?
This is communication
skills. So I would also like to see this same graph, but for time availability, right? Because one aspect related to compensating wage differentials is time availability or flexibility of jobs. And this may also be relevant for sorting across occupations of men and women and maybe migrants too.
What do you mean by time availability or flexibility?
So rigid schedules or working over weekends or working after 5 p.m.
Okay. That's interesting. Yeah, we could get that in the ONET.
And I don't know how the correlation between these type of jobs or more hazardous jobs and these jobs with more time availability looks like. Because if it's about gender, what you're talking about, this may be related.
Mm-hmm. That is interesting. Yeah, the women in the sample, are in lots of wait staff, home health care, cleaning, maids. I mean, there are many, many types of jobs, but those are some of the bigger ones for women. And you're right, those are jobs that are happening at off hours in many cases, if you will. So that is interesting. Okay, so again, we're
can I interrupt also, Madeline and Tab? Sorry, this is Chalar. Another thing I have noticed in the previous thing, especially when you were talking with the policemen and the firefighters, is the informality issue, right? Low-skilled immigrants are much more likely to be undocumented.
Yes.
And there's going to be that differentiation there as well. And the occupations they choose are not just hazardous, but also these are, you know, they're going to be going into ones that can be done informally. You can't be an informal police officer. And
yes.
Probably the same thing with dental assistant. But when you're working in construction or house cleaning, those are much easier to do. Do you kind of control for that?
No, again, we're not looking at the immigrants here per se, although we're going to look at the immigrant share to get at what we're actually going to look at, because we're interested in the natives. But you're right, there are big differences in what immigrants are going into these occupations, and the undocumented immigrants are going to be more concentrated within certain occupations, working in restaurants, working in construction, and so on. And in agriculture, where there are relatively few U.S. natives working, honestly, particularly at low education levels. All right, so the first thing that we're going to do is look at how immigration is affecting job characteristics. And so this is a kind of regression that we're very used to seeing, I think, in the wage literature. Yes.
Meta here. Maybe one comment here related to the comment we just had. So if undocumented immigrants are more common in these very or more dangerous occupation, should we worry that here we have some measurement area in our X variable that is correlated with the outcome and how to...
In terms of the immigrant share being mismeasured?
Yeah, and more so in the more dangerous occupations, right?
Oh, okay. So this is going to be, we're going to collapse down to state by year data. And this is not going to be the share of immigrants in your occupation when we look at this. So what we're going to start off by looking at is the average job characteristics. So these percentiles of our hazard, manual, and communications intensity of U.S. natives by state and year. And then we're going to look at how the change in the immigrant share in the state over these long differences, how that's affecting these average job characteristics. And the big concern is, of course, that the immigrant share here is endogenous. So therefore, we IV for it. And so I'm going to switch over to Chad, who did the heroic work of constructing these IVs to explain how it was done. So Chad.
All right. Well, thank you very much. So as Madeline said, we want to use an instrumental variable strategy here. And what we use is basically variations of the shift share IV. Because this is an immigration audience, I assume that most of us, if not all of us, are familiar with both the shift share and its drawbacks and criticisms. But nonetheless, let me talk through that a little bit more to give you a sense of what we're trying to do here. Well, effectively, what we're trying to do when we construct a shift share is we're trying to come up with a predicted foreign-born labor force that's coming from really two different terms. The first term in that product, I kind of think of that as sort of a local stock variable, if you like. What it's measuring is if you take all the immigrants living in the U.S. from some birthplace country B in 1980, what share of those workers are living in a particular state in that base year. And so I kind of think of that, as I said, that first term as sort of a local stock variable. And then the second term there is something like a national flow variable. Maybe not a purely flow variable, but something that's sort of definitely national in nature. And it has to do with how many immigrants are arriving to the country in these subsequent years. And so we use those two terms to calculate a predicted number of workers from a particular country living in a state in a point in time. We do something similar for the natives. We do kind of incorporate, are they living in the state that they were born in and so forth. The natives part isn't all that interesting. But then once we have these foreign-born predictions, we sum across birthplace and create our IV. Just to be a little bit clear on both the X variable and the IV of interest, we talk about these things in terms of representing immigrant shares or the change in immigrant shares. More specifically, what it is, it's the change in the foreign-born labor force normalized by the previous period's total labor force. We do that so that the variables are being driven completely by changes in foreign composition of a state, as opposed to natives moving across states or something like that. But we'll continue to use that terminology. Okay, and so our first instrumental variable is exactly that. I mean, it's this shift share IV that we've all known, loved or hated, and used repeatedly. The objections, of course, to that instrument are really kind of grounded in, like, is it really exogenous, right? Because if there's like an economic shock that happens in that base year that has some persistence to it, then it sort of violates our exogeneity assumptions, right? That persistence might be correlated with both the regressor and the outcome variable, and so that's problematic. And so what we try to do then is we're trying to create this alternative IV where those terms that construct the instrument are more plausibly exogenous, if you like. And so we kind of estimate these two parts separately, okay? And so what we have here is, consider that first term, which I've called this local stock variable. What's happening in 1980. Well, that's an observation that we can throw on the left-hand side of a regression. And on the right-hand side, we can include what's happening even further back in a time. Okay, so what's the foreign-born labor force from a country living in a state in 1920? So that's, 100 years ago. What was happening 100 years ago? And then exploiting some distance variation, right? How far apart are a given state and a given country? And we can do that allowing for country-specific slopes. And so that's what that second term is. We can do that also including dummy variables for a state sharing a border with Canada or sharing a border with Mexico, plus I think it's state and country fixed effects there. But effectively what we're trying to do is to use these, rely upon distance as a predictor for that stock variable, as opposed to whatever might have been happening in 1980 itself. We do the same thing for that second term in that IV construction, which is, this national immigration flow. I guess I call it a stock here, but the second term in that equation, basically saying, look, let's try to figure out how big the foreign-born population from a given country at a given point in time is, as a function of that source country's GDP, its population level, and again, fixed effects for the country of origin and the year of observation. And so if we can come up with predictions for those values using these more plausibly exogenous variables, then we can just kind of plug them into that standard shift share IV equation and come up with our instruments that way. And so that's this alternative that we use. Really, it's kind of a robustness check, if you like, for the standard IV. As we do this, importantly, both of our instrumental variable strategies have strong predictive power for our observed changes in foreign-born shares, high F-stats, strong coefficients, all those things that you would want for your IV. Okay, so with those two strategies in mind, let's talk about some results. So this is our first table of results. These coefficients here, just to be clear, come from 12 different individual regressions that are distinguished by, the columns here, whether we're talking about men or women, and whether we're talking about the traditional shift share instrumental variable or this geographic-based one that we've created. And then the rows are distinguished by the particular job characteristic that we're interested in. Okay. So I think I'm going to actually start with the bottom two columns there. And in some sense, measuring a manual skill response, measuring a communication skill response. Yeah, in some sense, that is a bit derivative of this, work that Giovanni and I did more than a decade ago. But we actually think it's kind of important to do here in this exercise, because I think that those results are something that people kind of believe in and think are plausible, that there's like a comparative advantage story out there such that when immigrants arrive into a state, that natives respond by doing less manual work and more communication work. And so we really wanted to start this exercise by asking ourselves, does that plausible story continue to hold up given the small changes that we've made in our own methodology for this paper, given the updated time period that we're looking at? And we find that, yeah, that story does hold, that as immigrants arrive, natives respond by doing less manual work and more communication work. The key result here that we want to emphasize is the hazard exposure result, which has this negative coefficient, regardless of gender, regardless of IV strategy. And so what we're finding is basically that this, 1 percentage point increase in the foreign-born labor force relative to initial employment decreases US-born men's hazard exposure by about 0.2% and women's by about 0.2 to 0.4%. And so you do see a hazard exposure response is quite similar to what you see for manual skills, which we think in and of itself is interesting and pretty consistent with what other people have done in the past. I'm going to go ahead, in the interest of time, skip over table 4, I think, and let's talk about wages, because I think that this is more new and specific to us as opposed to what some other folks have done. So to understand what's happening to wages or compensation paid for these skills or job characteristics, we actually have to take a multi-step approach. In the first step, what we do is we actually estimate 204 separate regressions. These are going to be individual regressions of log wages that are going to be specific to each state and year. So think 51 states in 4 years. And these individual regressions, we got the log wage on the left-hand side, and then on the right-hand side is going to have some standard demographic features, education, age, and so forth. But then importantly, we're going to have these occupation fixed effects, okay? And if we run all of these regressions, and you think that we have 200 regressions multiplied by 400 occupations, conceptually, we have something like 80,000 individual fixed effects coefficients for a specific occupation in a specific state at a specific period of time. And we don't really have 80,000 because not every state has every occupation and so forth. But, in principle, that's, what we're doing. And what those coefficients, those individual coefficients represent is they represent the log wage paid to an occupation in a state at a period of time, controlling for individual demographic character. I saw a clarifying question up there on the 204 separate regressions. It's 51 states if you count the District of Columbia as a state. And then it's 4 years. I think it's 90, 2000, 2010, and 2018. All right, so that's step 1. That's how we get the wages themselves. What we do in step 2 then is we really want to ask, how are these occupation by state by year wages, or how's their relationship to job characteristics changing as a result of immigration influxes here, right? And so let's think about what's going on here. In this regression specification, we have state by year fixed effects that are really controlling for how an increase in the foreign-born share is going to affect wage growth itself. That might be an interesting question, but we're not interested in it here. And we can't estimate it if we've got these fixed effects. Similarly, we have occupation fixed effects there. And so that's going to prevent us from understanding how a particular occupational characteristic is going to affect wage growth. Again, that might be an interesting question, but that's not what we're interested in. We don't really care what the compensating differential paid to hazard exposure, for example, might be. What we're actually interested in is how an immigration influx into a particular state affects the rate of return to a particular job characteristic, right? That's what that ADA term is basically trying to capture, okay? It's measuring how a 1 percentage point change in the state's immigration share is going to affect the compensating differential paid for hazardous exposure above and beyond its trend, or how it's affecting the rate of return for performing manual communication skills, if you like. Okay, so let's take a look at two tables of results before concluding here. So this first table, these are results from 12 different regressions. So it's measuring one job characteristic at a time. And the results here are pretty consistent with what we might expect from kind of a theory that as immigrants arrive into a particular state, because they're bringing manual skills and complementing communication skills, you see a decrease in the wage premium paid to manual work. You're seeing an increase in wage paid to communication work. And that's pretty consistent with, again, what Giovanni and I found 10 plus years ago. But this other interesting thing, the thing that Madeline and I are really trying to document, is that you also see a decrease in the compensating differential paid to hazard exposure as well, right? That's what those negative coefficients in that first row are really talking about. You see a larger effect for men than you do for women. In fact, the coefficient gets insignificant in that last column, although to be fair, the F-stats are a little bit weaker in that column than they are for the others. But again, that decline in that compensation paid for hazard exposure, it's pretty similar to what you're finding in the manual skill regressions. But those, as I said, those are from separate regressions where you take each skill individually. Let's take a look on the next slide about what happens if you put all of those skills together in a single regression. Okay, and so this is just 4 different regressions results. Each column in this case represents results from a different regression. And so we consider hazard exposure, manual skills, communication skills, all at the same time. And what do we find here? Well, what we're seeing here is some evidence that this increase in the foreign-born share is decreasing the compensation paid to manual skills, the rate of return to manual skills, and increasing the rate of return to communication skills, but really isn't doing anything to this compensating differential paid to hazardous exposure, which is to say that those hazardous exposure results from the previous slide, that they're kind of arising incidentally because hazardous exposure is so strongly related positively to manual skill performance, so negatively to communication skill performance. And so really it's the skill story that's kind of driving those previous results. Now, if you look across the gender or sex kind of differences here, that itself is kind of interesting, right? That you see a strong decline in manual skill compensation among men and a strong increase in the communication skill compensation paid to women. Incidentally, if you put men and women together in the same regression, you would get results that look much more like the results for women, where the action appears to be in the positive compensation increase for communication skill work. But yeah, ultimately, we think that this is an interesting result, that we're seeing kind of these effects that one might expect from a rational response to immigration, and that natives are being exposed less to hazardous conditions, but compensating differential paid to that exposure isn't changing once you control for these other factors. I'm going to turn it back to Madeline for some concluding thoughts.
We are happy to take questions, certainly since we only have a little less than 15 minutes left of everyone's time. But that really is the takeaway from the paper. And I think that Chad went through all of this very clearly, much more so than I ever could. But when you think about, bigger picture, the U.S. is now in a very different place than it was during much of the sample period that we look at, that we've had declines in immigrant inflows at the low end of the education spectrum. And so it's interesting to think about going forward what that means for the US labor market and who's going to be better or worse off. So we certainly, I'm happy to keep talking about policy, but I'm also, we would love to have feedback from you all.
Okay, thanks a lot, Madeline and Chad, for a great presentation. So I invite our panelists and the rest of attendees to contribute with questions and comments.
Jesús, can I ask you a quick question?
Yes, go ahead, please.
Ben, go on.
Thanks. Thanks. That's a great paper, very interesting. what I was wondering how I should think about the timing and the dynamics here, right? Because I mean, you have decennial censuses, which obviously makes looking into dynamics a bit hard, but you know, it obviously takes a bit of time if immigrants come into an occupation for natives to move out. So have you tried to even just look at, you know, further censuses further down the line to see whether, let's say, the inflow that came before 1980 had even an effect on the occupational structure and the pay differentials in, let's say, 2000 or 2010?
The most that I could say on that regard is we played with different kind of time horizons. So we looked at like 5-year periods and found very similar results. We kind of wanted to take a look at 1-year changes in jobs at an individual level, which you can kind of sort of do in using CPS data, but it's actually really sloppy. And a lot of measurement error and so forth. And so, you know, because part of the question I think is, you know, is it like an individual who's going to be changing their job? Like, oh, an immigrant arrived, now I'm going to change my job. Or is it something that has to do with like new labor market entrants versus old people who are just kind of changing? So we've looked into it a little bit, but probably not as much as you might like.
Yeah, that's a good idea to look at kind of the decade ago change and to do a looking at a lag. Thank you. I think I will say, I think we should do it. It had not occurred to at least me before, but the occupations, many of them that we're looking at are relatively easy to enter. The firefighters, police officers are sort of an anomaly within that in terms of requiring some testing, certainly physical tests I could never pass. Whereas, you know, almost anyone can be a waiter or waitress.
Yeah, I think some of those questions are interesting. They remind me of like the occupational licensing kind of discussions that people have had. And I saw the question in the Q&A bubble as well, which is something we'd considered at one point, but I can't remember how we handled it. It might have been just as simple as kicking out public sector employees and seeing if there was a response there. But we should probably think about that more.
Oh.
Okay, Simone?
My quick question, Chad and Madeline. You are assuming that the demand for these occupations are exogenous with respect to the arrival of immigrants? Or should we be concerned that some specific occupations might be on the rise precisely because of the arrival of the immigrants? I mean, you have just shown a few instances of what are these hazardous jobs. And I was wondering whether you had some that might be related. The demand for these occupations might be increasing with the arrival of immigrants.
I think it's entirely possible that employer demand for some of these occupations does change as a result of immigration. And if so, then that would result kind of in the opposite of what we're finding on the wage effects. Because if employers are demanding more workers in manual skill jobs or and less in communications jobs because they don't need them when the immigrants are coming. And it's hard to think about why you would need more communication skills workers when immigrants come, unless it's to provide social services for the immigrants, perhaps. That's interesting.
Yeah, I think one response is that we're hoping that the IV strategy is giving us an exogenous supply shift, and so that we're identifying the results based upon supply increases. But I also think that even the reverse story would be an interesting one, right? That with an OLS result where you might have these increases in demand, you know, what is that saying? You know, the firms are effectively increasing or changing their demand structure in a way that they're bringing in immigrants and taking natives out of these hazardous jobs. So there's part of me that sort of thinks it doesn't matter necessarily if it's a supply or demand issue that's doing it, and really it's getting at something like a welfare change without, you know, getting formally into welfare analysis. That there is this relationship that, you know, the immigrant presence is allowing native-born workers to be in less hazardous jobs.
I'm reluctant to say a lot about how this sausage here got made, and to make you all look carefully at the paper in case we draw you as referees, in which case please be kind. But our IV results are bigger in absolute value than our OLS results. And on the one hand, we think that maybe this goes back to Meta's point about undocumented, that to the extent that that's creating measurement error, our IV strategy may be helping with that. But also kind of another possibility is that immigrants are moving to areas where demand for their skills are strong, and therefore natives should be in those in those areas as well if they have those skills. And when we get rid of that pattern via the IV, that may help explain why we then find bigger changes in the wage premia and absolute value. And I think that might be consistent with the employer demand part, but I would need to think more about it.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Can I ask a quick question? This is fascinating, guys. I'm fully convinced of your results. I have a question. This is related to what something Chad had said. Now, the hazard level is also, one can see it as somewhat endogenous, right? Because the states can regulate and depend. I mean, construction work in the US is definitely safer than it is in many developing countries. So my question is twofold. You probably don't want to answer this in this paper, but is there state level variation in safety measurements, enforcement, and especially if that changes across states given the availability of immigrant labor, right? Construction work, or I'm making it up, other areas, maybe these some elected official thinks these guys are not voting, so I'm not going to enforce it as rigorously, or I'm not going to implement it in the first place.
Yeah, there are differences in state level variation in safety standards, sometimes or just call it like occupational licensing standards.
Exactly.
Right? It's sort of comical. My wife was a hairstylist for a long time, and so moving from where we lived to graduate school to over here and watching her have to get like relicensed every time when you think hair is hair. I mean, I see hair is hair, but yeah, little experience with that. So there are those differences that exist. One nice thing about our model specification to kind of get at some of that, I mean, we do have, we're measuring things in first differences, plus we have these state fixed effects in the model. So it's kind of absorbing quite a lot in terms of those trends that might happen. But I mean, I think there is this sort of overall theme that, we should probably think about these licensing kinds of issues a little bit more carefully.
Yeah. I guess this is supposed to be a commercial for our own paper as well as my book, but to advertise, I guess, Dillinger and McInerney's paper a little bit, that they go through, and they had what I wish had been my idea of looking at workers' comp claims by U.S. natives, and that workers' comp claims go down by U.S. natives the bigger the immigration into their, I believe they do it state level. And so you could think that if the jobs were getting worse for everybody, then workers' comp claims would be going up for U.S. natives too. Maybe.
Okay, Hillel, do you want to ask a question?
What I take from the paper is that you've been disentangling the effects across different things, wages, type of tasks, and exposure to hazard. But can you really decompose them somehow to talking about really compensating differentials and kind of make them comparable? Do you have a kind of counting exercise, even for motivation, using point estimates from other studies, maybe how much is, standard deviation in exposure to hazards worth in terms of wages and this kind of thing?
We should add that. We, as Chad said, we don't really look at the compensating differential, but the change in the compensating differential. But it would be good to discuss a little more whether there are compensating differentials and how big they are, and therefore what our results mean then. That's a valid point. Thank you.
I see it more as a selling, selling thing, a selling point, a motivational one. But I think to even something rough, but I think for me it would be useful just to gauge, the magnitudes. What are the orders of magnitude? What are we talking about, and so on.
Yeah. Yeah.
So thanks. It's
that's good.
very important, of course, and nice.
Yeah. I would say that some of the wage results in terms of magnitude, I actually think they're quite small, to be honest. Especially if you kind of think that the coefficient represents a bit of a like an elasticity or something like that. The standard deviation of our X variable, the foreign-born share, change in foreign-born share, is like 3 percentage points for men and 4 percentage points for women. And so if you look at any of those point estimates and multiply by 3 or 4, you can kind of contextualize things that way. But I'm not sure if that's getting at the full accounting exercise that you're looking for.
Okay, so we are running out of time, but I think Delia wanted to ask something. So please, Delia, go ahead.
Yes. So I guess I'm most excited, maybe because we're in a pandemic, about the ability of the occupation safety to change. So I think you can exploit, I don't know if you'll get anything out of it, exploit changes over time in the ONET data. I know it's been done and I can send you a reference. I don't know if you'll get anything out of it. The other thing that I was wondering is there variation across occupations in the ability to make them safer? For example, are there any measures about how easy it is to substitute workers with labor? Mm-hmm. And can an occupation become safer if you use more technology? I don't know if such a variable exists, though.
No, that's a great question. In terms of, thinking about using ONET to look at changes over time, I mean, effectively what you could do is, we have one ONET, or we're relying upon one ONET data set. I think it's like version 24.2. What if we went back and used version 5.0 or something like that and looked at changes? There are difficulties in doing that because some of the occupation codings that ONET uses might change.
Samples were tiny initially.
Yeah. Trying to understand why were the updates going there? Well, it was like this move. I forget which way the move went, but like some occupations were based upon like 30 respondents that happened to hold that occupation, and some were based on occupational experts, whatever that is, right? And I forget which way they moved, but like, so each update would have more of the one that they're moving to. Yeah, so I'm not sure that can be done in the same way that we might like to do it.
And I know that we're over time, so we should let Jesús wrap up. But thank you all so much for being so generous with your time and your thoughts.
Thank you, Madeline, for finishing on that note. I mean, I think that the Delia's point was actually very related with the comment that it's still open, and I think it's a very interesting question from the Q&A about thinking more about the future or rather than about the past. But yeah, this opens many interesting discussions that we can have later. Thanks a lot for attending, and thanks for the great presentation. And I hope to see you all next week in the next edition of the seminar. Bye.